30 below zero. The cold didn't just bite. It welded the air in the lungs, turning every breath into a calculated risk. Inside the fractured concrete shell of the bunker, the wind screamed through the exposed rebar like a dying train whistle. Sable lay motionless on the pile of frozen debris. She didn't shiver. Shivering created heat, and heat was a beacon to the thermal optics hunting her outside. Instead, she reached out with a glove stiffened by frost and pulled a layer of fresh powder over her thermal hood. She was cooling the signature, burying the human shape, us end of the storm. A vibration buzzed against her collarbone, short and sharp. The perimeter sensor she had rigged 40 minutes ago near the tree line had tripped. The dead man's switch activated. Someone had crossed the wire. They were inside the kill box. She didn't panic. She breathed out. A slow, controlled exhale that crystallized instantly on her face mask. The waiting was over. The physics of the trap had begun to turn. She shifted her weight, feeling the jagged concrete bite through her elbow pads. Her right hand moved to the rifle. The metal of the receiver was a block of ice, cold enough to burn skin through the tactical fabric of her gloves. She didn't cycle the bolt to check the chamber. Metal on metal would crack like a whip in this acoustic void. She knew the count. She had calculated it before the storm swallowed the light. 3 rounds. 3.338 Lapua Magnum cartridges left to hold back a Tier 1 unit. Outside the shattered wall, the wind dropped for a heartbeat. In that gap, a new sound registered. Crunch, crunch, heavy boots breaking the crust of the hard snow. The rhythm was deliberate. They weren't searching anymore. They were closing. Sable pressed her cheek against the composite stock, fighting the numbness creeping into her trigger finger. She wiggled it once, twice, forcing sluggish blood into the capillaries. Pain was good. Pain meant the nerves were still live. She watched the grey slit of the firing port, measuring the distance by the volume of the crunch. 50 meters. Maybe 40. Static hissed in her earpiece, sounding like coarse sandpaper dragged across a microphone. It cut through the white noise of the blizzard, a jagged line of interference. Then a voice broke the static. Crisp. Professional. No fear in the tone sector, 4 clear. Target, isolated inside structure. They had the grid. They had the structure. They thought they had the geometry of the fight. Sable didn't correct them. She rolled her wrist slightly, just enough to expose the face of her tactical watch without lifting her arm. The screen glowed with a faint, disciplined light, shielded by her sleeve. A single green dot pulsed steadily at the center of the display. Beside the dot, a number held steady, 60. 60 beats per minute. Mako's heart rate. The dog was out there in the whiteout, submerged in the same freezing hell, facing the same kill team. And his pulse was lower than a sleeping man's. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. The control anchored her. The cold in her chest tightened, shifting from hollow fear to a hard, crystalline focus. If Mako was calm, the variable was constant. The equation still held. They weren't just surviving. They were synchronized. Sable reached up to her collar. Her fingers felt like wood, thick and clumsy against the nylon, but she found the flat plastic surface of the haptic button. She didn't tap it frantically. She pressed it once. A single, solid depression that sent a silent command through the RF link. One buzz. The signal sent "hold" on her neck. The receiver vibrated back a confirmation. A ghost touch in the dark. The boots outside stopped. The crunch-crunch rhythm died, replaced by the howling wind. They were right outside the breach. She could feel the pressure change. the heaviness of bodies displacing the air near the entrance. Most handlers would have pulled the trigger now. They would have panicked at the proximity, desperate to push the threat back. Sable settled the crosshairs on the empty grey space where a head would appear. She slowed her breathing until the frost on her mask stopped growing. Let them step into the door. Let them think the silence was submission. The trap wasn't the bunker. The trap was the assumption that she was alone. Sable didn't pull her eye from the crack in the concrete. The aperture was less than an inch wide, a jagged scar in the bunker wall that offered a surgical view of the whiteout. Through the scope, the world was a monochromatic nightmare of grey wind and black pine. She watched the enemy formation fan out. They weren't a militia. Militia moved in clumps, seeking reassurance in proximity, their spacing collapsing as the temperature dropped. These men moved in a rigid delta pattern, maintaining 10-meter intervals despite the blinding snow. They checked their sectors with the mechanical precision of a metronome. The commander stood near the center, a dark anchor in the storm. He didn't shout orders. He raised a gloved hand, fingers splayed, then clenched into a fist. Hold. The line froze instantly. They were disciplined. They were professional. And they were hunting a woman they thought was trapped in a hole. Inside the bunker, the silence felt heavy, pressurized by the screaming wind outside. Sable adjusted her position by millimeters, easing the weight off her left elbow. The cold seeped through the mats, a slow, numbing poison that threatened to dull her reflexes. She flexed her toes inside her boots, counting the sensation. 1, 2, 3. Still there. She forced herself to breathe shallowly, directing the exhaust downward to keep the frost from building up on the lens. Every movement had a caloric cost. Every second of observation burned energy she couldn't replace. But she didn't look away. She needed to see the flaw in their geometry. She needed to see where the machine would break. On the far right flank, a single soldier drifted. He was the outlier, separated from the nearest teammate by a thick, the swirling veil of blowing snow. He paused near the tree line, his silhouette blurring against the dark mass of the forest. Through the magnification, Sable saw him tap his helmet. He was adjusting his night vision goggles, fighting the same tech failure she would have faced if she had relied on optics. The whiteout was scattering the ambient light, turning his expensive thermal gear into a useless blindfold of static. He was frustrated. He was distracted. He took a half step back, trying to clear the snow from his lens, breaking the perfect symmetry of the line. He was 10 meters too far from safety. Sable held her breath. She didn't look at her watch. She didn't check the haptic button. She just watched the gap between the man and the trees. The attack didn't look like violence. It looked like a magic trick. 1 second. The flanker was there, a solid shape adjusting his gear, his posture radiating irritation. The next, he was gone. He didn't fall. He was yanked backward, horizontal to the ground, disappearing into the black throat of the forest with terrifying speed as the harness dragged him under. There was no scream, no shout for help. The wind swallowed the sound of the scuffle, leaving only a faint, dull thud of a body hitting a tree trunk, and then the sharp crack of a dry branch snapping under weight. Then silence. Absolute, heavy silence that pressed against Sable's ears like water. The snow where he had stood was disturbed, a chaotic scuff mark that the wind was already beginning to erase. The rest of the unit didn't turn. The wind was howling too loud, masking the abduction perfectly. They were still watching the bunker. They didn't know their flank was already open. Sable exhaled slowly, the breath hissing through her teeth. She waited for the kill confirmation. It came a second later, not as a sound, but as a feeling. Her collar buzzed again. 2 short pulses against her skin. Execute, good. The signal was clean. Mechanical. It meant the threat was neutralized. It meant the second unit was operational and autonomous. Mako wasn't just surviving out there. He was dismantling them. Sable glanced at her wrist. The green dot was still steady. The heart rate had spiked only slightly, to 90, then settled back down. Controlled aggression. She looked back through the crack. The gap in the enemy line was still there, an empty space where a man used to be. The commander raised his hand again, signaling an advance. He didn't know yet, but the math of the fight had just changed. They thought they were the hunters. They were about to learn they were the bait. The silence inside the bunker didn't last. It was broken not by a scream, but by the pressurized hiss of the wind finding a new angle through the shattered concrete. Sable shifted her weight, the cold radiating from the floor like a physical bruise against her hip. She kept her eye pressed to the keyhole crack. Outside, the geometry of the snowfield had changed. The perfect delta formation was broken. The gap on the right flank where the soldier had vanished was still open, a void in their discipline. But the rest of the unit was reacting. They didn't panic. They didn't spray fire into the trees. They compressed. The line tightened, shields overlapping, barrels raising in unison toward the dark mass of the forest. They were treating the disappearance not as a supernatural event, but as a tactical flank. They were professionals, and that made them dangerous. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with the smell of old dust and freezing iron. On the rusted metal casing of a generator near the door, a yellow warning label was peeling at the corners. It was faded, the black block letters barely legible. In the gloom, FOD, Control Area. Foreign Object Debris. A rule from a time when this place had power, when mechanics worried about loose bolts destroying turbines. Now, the rule felt like a dark joke. She and Mako were the foreign objects here, and the debris was about to be human. Sable checked her scope again. The frost was creeping in from the edges of the lens, a white vignette narrowing her world. She just breathed shallower, starving the moisture in the air. A voice cut through the static in her earpiece. It was the commander again. His tone hadn't spiked. It was flat, annoyed, like a man dealing with a jammed printer rather than a missing man. Bravo 4. Check in. Silence. The radio channel was awash of white noise. The sound of the ionosphere screaming, Bravo 4. Status. Nothing. The commander didn't scream. He didn't curse. He tapped his helmet, then signaled to the man on his left. A hand chop. Check tech. They thought it was a battery failure. They thought the cold had killed the radio. They didn't know the cold had help. The commander took a step forward, breaking the line, his weapon raised. He was looking at the ground where Bravo 4 had stood. He was looking for a body. He wouldn't find one. Mako didn't leave debris. Sable rested her finger on the trigger guard. The metal was so cold it burned, a searing line of pain that shot up her wrist. She needed to sow chaos before they figured out the math. If they realized Bravo 4 was gone, physically gone, they would switch from containment to hunting. She needed them confused. She needed them to doubt their eyes. She centered the crosshairs on the man next to the commander. Bravo 2. He was scanning the tree line, his head turning in jerky, robotic movements. He was terrified, but his discipline held him in place. That made him a stationary target. Sable calculated the windage. The storm was gusting left to right, full value. At 50 meters, the drift was negligible for a .338, but the visibility was the killer. She waited for a lull in the whiteout. A split second where the veil thinned. Crack. The shot was muffled by the storm, sounding less like a gunshot and more like a dry branch snapping under a boot. Inside the bunker, the recoil punched her shoulder, a dull thud against the bruise that was already forming. Outside, Bravo, 2 dropped. He didn't spin. He didn't flail. He just collapsed, his legs folding under him as if the strings had been cut. "Got you!" The reaction was instant. The unit didn't return fire immediately. They didn't know where it came from. The wind had swallowed the muzzle flash, and the sound was diffracted by the snow. Sniper. "Sector 12, one voice yelled. Panic fraying the edge of the discipline. Negative? "Contact rear." "Bravo 4 is gone," another voice shouted. Pitch rising. Multiple contacts. "We are flanked." They were spinning. The commander shouted a sharp order, an unintelligible bark that cut through the confusion. Hold. But the line was fracturing. They were looking at the trees where Mako was. They were looking at the bunker where Sable was. They were doing the math, and the numbers weren't adding up. 15 men against 2 heat signatures. But one man was gone, and another was down. The equation was breaking. And in the snow, the trap was no longer a cage. It was a grinder. Sable didn't watch Bravo 2 hit the ground. She was already moving the bolt, a fluid, practiced motion that felt like grinding glass in the sub-zero air, the spent casing ejected, a brass arc in the gloom, spinning into the snow with a soft hiss as the hot metal met the ice. A tiny plume of steam rose and vanished instantly. She didn't track it. Her eye was glued to the scope, hunting for the flash of movement that would signal a counterattack. But the enemy wasn't firing at her. They were breaking. The tight, disciplined geometry of the delta formation had shattered into chaotic angles. Men were shouting, their voices torn into jagged strips by the wind, barely audible over the gale. They were looking at the trees where Bravo 4 had vanished. They were looking at the snow where Bravo 2 lay crumpled. They were looking everywhere except the bunker. The wind had swallowed the sound of the shot, leaving them with a casualty but no vector. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the howling gale and the panicked crunch of boots on hard pack as they scrambled for cover that didn't exist. The commander's voice cut through the static, louder now, the calm veneer cracking under the strain of an impossible equation. Contact front. Sniper. Suppression fire on the tree line. Move. He was wrong. He was reacting to the ghost, not the shooter. He thought the threat was in the forest because that was where the fear was coming from. Mako had done his job. He had turned the darkness into a weapon. 3 soldiers opened up on the pines, their muzzle flashes blooming like strobe lights in the whiteout. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was flat, deadened by the storm, but the tracers tore through the branches, shredding wood and shadow. They were killing trees. They were wasting ammunition on a phantom. Sable watched the display through her optic, her breath hitching as a spasm of shivering racked her frame. The cold was a parasite now, burrowing deep into her marrow, turning her joints into rusted hinges. It demanded energy she didn't have. But the distraction was perfect. They were fully committed to the wrong war. Sable settled the crosshairs again. The metal of the rifle stock bit into her cheek, burning the skin like dry ice. She ignored it. Pain was just data. It told her the nerves were still conductive. She shifted her aim to the left flank, where a heavy gunner was trying to set up a bipod in the deep snow. He was struggling, his movements jerky and panicked. The crust of the snow kept breaking under the weight of the gun, throwing off his balance. He wasn't checking his sector. He was looking over his shoulder at the empty space where his flanker used to be. He was terrified of the dark. Sable exhaled, watching the vapor cloud vanish instantly in the gale. She didn't need to lead the target. At this range, it was point blank for a .338. She squeezed. Crack. The gunner dropped. His weapon fell silent before it ever spoke. The commander saw the angle this time. He stopped firing at the trees. He turned, his NVG-clad face scanning the grey ruin of the bunker. He saw the flash. He saw the geometry. Structure! It's the structure! Front! Multiple contacts! We are flanked! The panic was total now. The discipline of Unit Vanguard had dissolved into survival instinct. They weren't a unit anymore. They were individuals trapped in a kill box they couldn't see. The commander shouted a sharp order, an unintelligible bark that cut through the confusion. Hold. Flank right. He wasn't retreating. He was adapting. He knew the sniper was stationary. He knew the dog was loose. He was going to trade bodies for ground. He was coming for her. Sable didn't wait. She pressed the haptic button on her collar. 3 pulses. Return. The signal sent. Return. Now. She pulled the rifle back from the port, the movement sending a fresh wave of agony through her frozen shoulders. She grabbed the grab handle of her pack and dragged it across the floor. The FOD sign above the generator seemed to mock her as she passed. Debris. That's what they were now. Just debris in the storm. Outside, the crunch of boots was getting louder, faster. The rhythm had changed. It wasn't the slow, deliberate stalk of containment anymore. It was the heavy, desperate sprint of men who knew they were dying. They were coming to kill the thing in the hole. But the hole was already empty. Sable ran. It wasn't a sprint. Sprinting in waist-deep powder was a suicide pact with physics. It burned glycogen stores in seconds and left the body shivering in a hypoglycemic crash within minutes. This was a controlled fall forward, a rhythmic, grinding trudge against gravity and the gale. Her body was angled at 45 degrees to cut the wind, but the gusts slammed into her like invisible riot shields, threatening to knock her flat with every step. Her legs felt alien. Heavy things made of lead pipes filled with ice water. The sensation had moved past pain 10 minutes ago. Now, it was just a dull, terrifying heaviness, a numbness that crept up from her knees toward her hips. Every lift of a boot was a negotiation with a nervous system that was screaming to shut down. Her lungs burned as if she were inhaling ground glass. The sub-zero air didn't just enter her chest. It froze the moisture in her throat before it could reach her alveoli, creating a dry, hacking cough that tasted of copper and ozone. Move. The command was a metronome in her head, ticking over the roar of the storm. Move. Breathe. Check. Move. She didn't look back. Looking back shifted the center of gravity. It cost momentum. It cost time. And right now, time wasn't money. Time was heat. And heat was the only currency that mattered. The terrain ahead began to change. The dense, sheltering geometry of the pine forest thinned out, replaced by a flat, desolate expanse of wind-scoured snow. It was a killing field. No trees, no rocks. Just a white sheet stretched tight over the earth, exposed to every eye in the sky. In the center of the corridor, a half-buried metal sign protruded from a drift like a tombstone. The red paint had been scoured down to the grey primer by years of ice storms, but the stamped letters were still legible, screaming in block capitals. Caution. Jet blast area. It was a relic from the Cold War, a ghost marker from when this strip was an emergency runway for bombers that never launched. Now, it was just a marker for exposure. A boundary line. If they crossed this, they would be visible for 2 clicks to anyone with a thermal scope. But there was no choice. The trees were deep, but they were slow. This corridor was the only vector to the extraction point that didn't require snowshoes. Sable checked her watch. She didn't lift her arm, she just rotated her wrist, keeping the movement inside her silhouette. The green dot was steady, a tiny pulse of life in the grey, but the battery icon next to it was flashing red. The cold was draining the lithium-ion cells faster than the spec sheet promised. Chemical betrayal. They had maybe 20 minutes of comms left. Then the silence would be absolute. Mako was 10 meters ahead. He didn't look like a dog anymore. He looked like a shadow, a smear of ink flowing over the white ground. He didn't run in a straight line. He wove, a serpentine pattern that used the micro-terrain of snowdrifts to break his silhouette. He was reading the wind better than she ever could. Every few seconds he paused, one paw lifted, his ears swiveling like radar dishes scanning the frequency of the storm. He stopped. He looked back at her. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just stood there, his breath puffing in short, sharp bursts of steam that vanished instantly. His yellow eyes were flat, unblinking. Waiting. Trust. The word wasn't an emotion. It was a tactical variable. Sable felt the primal urge to check her six, to scan the tree line behind them for the thermal bloom of a cobalt pursuit team. Her neck muscles twitched with the phantom sensation of a crosshair settling on her spine. The itch between her shoulder blades was unbearable, but she knew the math. If she turned, she would slow down. If she slowed down, the cold would catch her before the enemy did. Mako was the rear guard and the scout wrapped in one. If he wasn't growling, the rear was clear. She forced her eyes forward. She committed her weight to the next step. She kept moving toward the dog. Coming. The wind shifted again, a sudden downdraft that slammed them from the north. It carried a scent that cut through the sterile metallic taste of the cold. It wasn't pine. It wasn't ice. It was fuel, old, heavy diesel and aviation kerosene, trapped in the ice for decades and released by the storm. It smelled like a machine graveyard. It smelled like mistakes. They were leaving a trail. Sable looked down. Every step she took punch-holed the hard crust of the snow, creating a perfect, dark blue shadow in the white. A breadcrumb path. A thermal pocket that would glow for an hour before the cold neutralized it. Even without tech, a tracker could follow this at a jog. Sable knew it. Cobalt would know it. They weren't escaping. They were just trading position for time. The ghost unit myth wouldn't hold out here. The stories about the invisible sniper and the demon dog evaporated in the physics of deep snow. Out here, they were just meat moving across a white sheet. Heavy, tired, warm meat, but they were moving. And for now, motion was the only physics that kept the blood from turning into sludge. She gritted her teeth against the pain in her ribs and forced another step. 1 more meter. 1 more second. The audit could wait. The dying could wait. The job was to move. The adrenaline that had sustained Sable for the last 40 minutes began to curdle into a toxic sludge. It was a chemical crash, abrupt and brutal. Her body wasn't just cold anymore, it was vibrating with a systemic failure that felt less like shivering and more like the rattling of a loose bolt in an engine block. The sensation started in her extremities, a dull, thrumming ache in her fingertips where the capillaries had collapsed and moved inward, gripping her spine. Nausea rolled in her stomach, a cold, heavy wave triggered by the metallic taste of adrenaline withdrawal. She swallowed it down, but the taste remained, like sucking on a penny. Her hearing was degrading. The wind outside wasn't just a noise, it was a physical pressure against her eardrums, a static roar that buried the finer frequencies. She pressed a hand to the side of her helmet, trying to clear the tinnitus that whined like a high-tension wire. She needed to move. Staying static meant death by exposure, but her legs felt disconnected, heavy pillars of meat that responded to her commands with a terrifying half-second lag. This was the invoice. This was the cost of operating in the red zone without a thermal break. She shifted her position near the rebar, intending to check the tree line, when the darkness 10 meters to her left dissolved into violence. It didn't start with a sound. It started with a disruption of the snow, a sudden explosive displacement of white powder as Mako broke cover. He wasn't barking. He was a silent kinetic missile, launching at a shadow that had separated from the pines. The shadow the Cobalt commander didn't panic. He pivoted, his movements fluid despite the heavy gear. He didn't raise his rifle. He knew the range was too close. His right hand blurred, drawing a combat knife from his chest rig in a seamless, practiced arc. The blade was matte black, a void in the visual field, disappearing into the fur and mass of the attacking dog. There was no cinematic clash of metal. There was a sickening, wet sound, like canvas tearing under extreme tension, followed by the dull, heavy thud of bodies colliding. Mako didn't yelp. He didn't recoil. He made a sound Sable had never heard, a low, gurgling vibration that wasn't a growl, but the sound of air being forced through fluid. On Sable's wrist, the world contracted to a single flashing rectangle. She didn't hear the alarm she had killed the audio profile hours ago, but the visual strobe was screaming. The steady green dot that had anchored her sanity for the last hour was gone. In its place, a red bar spiked and crashed violently across the OLED screen. The digital readout flickered and locked. 180. 180 beats per minute. That wasn't exertion. That wasn't the elevated pulse of a working dog. That was trauma. That was a biological system flooding with histamine and catecholamines to fight catastrophic shock. The asset status indicator blinked a single word: critical. The logic of the sniper cover, distance, concealment, evaporated instantly. The tactical math that said she should use Mako as a distraction to flank the enemy turned into ash. The private rule, the one she never wrote down in any AAR, slammed into place like a blast door. He is not expendable. He was not equipment. He was the other half of her nervous system, and he was bleeding out in the snow. Sable abandoned the rifle. She didn't sling it, she dropped it. The weapon clattered against the concrete, a noise that would have horrified her 5 minutes ago. She didn't care. She drew her sidearm, the movement tearing a frozen muscle in her shoulder, sending a spike of white-hot agony down her arm. She ignored it. She vaulted the low wall of the ruin, her boots skidding on the ice-slicked concrete, and sprinted. The snow in the open was knee-deep, a heavy, sucking weight that tried to anchor her to the kill zone. She fought it, driving her legs like pistons, her breath tearing out of her throat in ragged gasps. The commander was on one knee, struggling to rise, the knife raised high for a finishing downward thrust into the dog's neck. He was efficient. He was finishing the job. He never saw the variable he hadn't calculated. Sable didn't shout. She didn't warn him. She closed the distance to 2 meters, extended the pistol with a two-handed grip that trembled violently, and fired. The muzzle flash was blinding in the dark. The round took him in the side of the helmet, snapping his head back with mechanical violence. He collapsed, a marionette with cut strings, burying the knife harmlessly in the drift. Sable hit the ground beside the dog, her knees slamming into the hardpack. The impact jarred her teeth, but she was already holstering the weapon, her hands seeking the damage. Mako. Quiet. Stay. Her voice sounded alien, cracked, and thin in the wind. She stripped off her heavy outer gloves, needing the tactile sensitivity of the liners. Her fingers were instantly numb, but she forced them to work, probing the thick fur of his flank. It was wet, hot, sticky wetness that steamed in the freezing air. The smell of iron and copper assaulted her, cutting through the ozone of the storm. She found the tear. The knife had sliced the Kevlar vest open, a jagged gash exposing the dark fur underneath. But the mesh had held just enough. The cut was deep, a long laceration across the ribs, but it hadn't opened the chest cavity. It was a flesh wound, ugly and profuse, but not terminal. Not yet. The blood was already thickening, turning into a dark, gelatinous sludge on her fingers as the temperature sucked the heat out of it. Sable grabbed a packet of coagulant gauze from her med pouch, ripping the package open with her teeth. She jammed the gauze into the wound, applying pressure. Mako whined, a high, thin sound that broke her heart, but he didn't bite. He pressed his weight against her, seeking the heat. Sable leaned forward. For 1 second, One single, expensive, dangerous second. She pressed her forehead against his broad, flat skull. She closed her eyes, feeling the frantic jackhammer rhythm of his heart against her chest, syncing with her own. "I've got you," she whispered. "We're leaving." She pulled back. The moment was over. The watch on her wrist was still flashing red, the number dropping slowly to 160. They were alive, but they were compromised. The snow around them was marked with blood and brass and bodies. The trail they left now wouldn't just be footprints. It would be a highway for anyone left to follow. The invoice had been paid, but the transaction wasn't finished. She grabbed Mako's harness handle. "Up," she commanded. "We move." A faint radio crackle hissed from the commander's fallen body. "Endex, stand down." The fluorescent lights didn't just hum. They vibrated inside the skull, a high-frequency dental drill that drilled directly into the migraine building behind Sable's eyes. The room smelled of stale coffee, ozone from a laser printer that was jamming every 30 seconds, and the faint, pervasive scent of wet wool and bureaucratic apathy. It was a processing center, a liminal space between the field and the debrief, designed to strip away the adrenaline of combat and replace it with the crushing weight of paperwork. A stapler clicked thunk-click, with a rhythm that felt like a gavel hitting a sounding block. Every sound was sharp, amplified by the sterile acoustics of the linoleum floor and the cinder-block walls painted a soul-crushing beige. Sable stood in front of the counter, her posture rigged into a parody of compliance. Her uniform was still damp, the cold of the snow melting into a clammy, suffocating heat under the artificial lights. Mako sat beside her left boot, a dark, silent statue. He wasn't panting. He was watching the gatekeeper. The man behind the glass wasn't a soldier. He was a logistics officer, a master of forms and inventory, whose weapon was a red stamp and a refusal to make eye contact. He typed something on his keyboard, the keys clacking like dry bones, then sighed. It was a long, theatrical sigh that communicated the immense burden of dealing with anomalies. He didn't look at Sable. He looked at the screen. "Unit designation?" he asked. His voice was flat, bored, devoid of curiosity. "Neen Unit 4 Alpha," Sable replied. Her voice was rough, the throat still raw from the cold air. "Asset ID?" "Mako. 9773. The man stopped typing. He picked up a folder, flipped it open, and pointed a pen at a tab labelled in bold black letters, "Target Fixation." He tapped it once. "Incident report flags indicate non-standard engagement protocols," he said, reading from the form as if reciting a grocery list. "Asset sustained damage due to operator error. Status is pending evaluation." He reached under the counter and produced a clipboard and a heavy nylon leash with a chain lead. He slid them through the slot in the glass. The metal of the clip scraped against the counter, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Sign the custody transfer," he said. "Asset goes to veterinary holding for assessment. You go to debrief, room 404. Sable looked at the leash. It was a restraint. It was the tool they used for equipment that was broken or dangerous. She looked at Mako. The dog hadn't moved, but his ears had swiveled back, catching the frequency of the threat in the man's tone. He knew. He knew he was being itemized. The logistics officer looked up, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were empty, glazed with the boredom of a man who saw soldiers as columns on a spreadsheet. "It's just protocol, Sergeant," he said, his tone softening into a condescending patience. "We need to verify the tool is still functional." The word hung in the air, heavier than the humidity. Tool. It was a category, a classification that stripped away the partnership, the shared blood, the synchronization of heartbeats in the snow. It reduced the living, thinking creature beside her to a hammer that might have a cracked handle. Sable felt the heat rise in her neck, a dangerous flush that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Her hand moved, not to the pen, but to Mako's harness handle. She tightened her grip, feeling the solid living warmth of him. She didn't shout. She didn't slam the glass. She leaned in just an inch, invading the sterile air of the slot. "He's not a tool," she said. The sentence was flat, quiet, and absolutely final. It wasn't a debate. It was a fact she was etching into the glass. The logistics officer blinked. The boredom cracked, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He looked at her hand on the harness, then back at the form. He opened his mouth to cite a regulation, to quote the rulebook that governed his small, orderly world. "Stand down." Before he could speak, the door behind him buzzed. It was a heavy, magnetic lock, disengaging with a solid clack. The sound cut through the hum of the lights. The logistics officer turned, surprised. A shadow fell across the glass, stretching out from the opening door. It wasn't another clerk. The silhouette was tall, motionless, and radiated a gravity that sucked the air out of the room. The paper shuffling stopped. The printer paused. The administrative friction halted, suspended by a new, heavier pressure. Someone with the power to override the forms had just entered the cage, and they weren't here to check boxes. The room was a box built for attrition. It measured 10 feet by 10 feet, a sealed cube of cinder block painted a shade of beige that seemed designed to induce fatigue. There were no windows. The ventilation system was a low, persistent drone, a mechanical hum that vibrated the metal table bolted to the floor. The air was recycled, stale, and smelled faintly of ozone and old coffee that had burned on a hot plate hours ago. It was the smell of bureaucracy waiting for a confession. Sable sat in the only chair that wasn't occupied by an interrogator. She didn't fidget. She didn't clean the dried blood on her gloves. She just breathed, matching her rhythm to the slow, heavy cycling of the fan. Mako was under the table, a warm, silent weight against her boots. He wasn't sleeping. His chin was resting on her foot, his eyes open in the gloom, watching the door. The 2 junior officers across from her were getting restless. They had been asking the same questions for 20 minutes, questions about engagement protocols, about ammunition expenditure, about why a dog was bleeding on a government floor. They were young, eager, and terrified of making a mistake. They wanted a form filled out. They wanted the chaos of the night to fit into a box. The door didn't just open, it unsealed. The sound was a heavy pneumatic hiss, followed by the solid metallic thunk of a steel bolt retracting. It wasn't the sound of a visitor. It was the sound of an airlock cycling. The pressure in the room shifted instantly. The stale heat was cut by a sudden sharp draft of cool air from the corridor, carrying the scent of rain and wet concrete. The conversation died. The junior officer who had been mid-sentence something about a Section 9 violation snapped his mouth shut. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. It pressed against the eardrums. A man stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing a dress uniform. He was wearing a grey tactical fleece that had seen weather, with no rank insignia on the shoulders, only the faded outline where a patch had once been velcroed. He was of average height, unassuming, but he moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He didn't look at the officers. He didn't look at Sable. He walked to the centre of the table, the only empty space in the room, and pulled out a chair. The scrape of the metal legs on the linoleum was the loudest sound in the world. Captain Voss sat down. He placed his hands on the table, fingers laced together. They were clean, steady hands, the hands of a man who signed death warrants and grocery lists with the same pen. He reached into his fleece pocket and produced a single object. He didn't slam it down. He placed it on the metal surface with a soft, deliberate click. It was a credential card. Matte black. No photo, no name. Just a diagonal cut on the top right corner and a thin red metallic strip running down the centre. Embossed in the black plastic were 2 characters. Quate 4. The effect on the room was physical. The junior officer who had been leaning forward, aggressive and righteous, recoiled as if the card were a live grenade. His face strained of colour, the blood retreating to his core. He pushed his chair back, the movement jerky and loud, desperate to put distance between himself and the black plastic. The logistics clerk in the corner stopped typing. He closed his laptop slowly, a gesture of surrender, and folded his hands in his lap, staring intently at his own shoes. The air in the room had changed from interrogation to funeral. Voss hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. The card was the loudest voice in the building. Voss reached out and pulled the incident folder toward him. It was a thick stack of paper, the documentation of Sable's night, her choices, her unauthorized shots. He didn't open it. He didn't read the charges. He simply placed his hand on the cover, a flat palm that claimed ownership of the narrative. "This file is closed," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection, a statement of fact that allowed no appeal. He opened a drawer in the table, a drawer Sable hadn't known was there, and produced a heavy rubber stamp. He inked it, a slow, methodical motion, and pressed it onto the cover of the file. Thud. The red ink bled into the beige cardstock. Restricted. Then he looked at the junior officer. "Leave the copies." The officer scrambled. He didn't argue. He gathered the loose papers, the handwritten notes, the printed forms, his hand shaking so badly he dropped a pen. He left it. He piled the paper trail in front of Voss, a sacrificial offering, and retreated to the door. The clerk followed him. They didn't salute. They didn't look back. They fled the radiation of the Q4 clearance. The door clicked shut, sealing the room again. Sable sat alone with the man who owned her life. She felt the weight of the protection. It wasn't a relief. It was a cage. Voss looked at her for the first time. His eyes were grey, flat, assessing. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't ask about her injuries. He looked at the space under the table where Mako lay. He nodded once, a microscopic acknowledgement. Asset operational. The incident at Sector 4 didn't happen, Voss said. He wasn't asking. The damage to the asset was a training accident during a live-fire exercise, mechanical failure of the target drone. Do you copy? It was a script. A lie, constructed to pave over the incompetence of Unit Vanguard and the blood she had spilled. It saved her career. It saved Mako from being decommissioned as unstable, but it cost the truth. It erased the reality of their survival. Sable looked at the black card, then at the sealed file. She swallowed the protest. She swallowed the pride. "Copy," she said, the word bitter on her tongue. Voss didn't smile. He took a pen and wrote something on a small yellow sticky note. He peeled it off and slapped it onto the folder. "Initiate Phase 2. He stood up, taking the file and the card. "Clean your gear," he said. "We have a new timeline." He walked out. The door closed. On the table, the ghost of his presence remained, and on the folder he carried away, under the hall light, the yellow note had flashed a single command. The lock on the records room door didn't click. It crunched. It was an old, heavy mechanism that hadn't been oiled since the Cold War, the sound of dry tumblers grinding against brass. Sable turned the key, feeling the resistance in her wrist. The door groaned open, revealing a space that smelled of time. It wasn't the sharp chemical ozone of the SCIF or the wet wool of the corridor. It was the smell of paper that had been slowly oxidizing for decades, a dry, sweet scent like vanilla and dust. The room was narrow, lined floor to ceiling with metal shelving units that sagged under the weight of bankers' boxes. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once, buzzing like an entrapped insect, before settling into a dim, yellow hum. Sable stepped inside. Voss was already there. He was standing by a small metal table in the back corner, his back to the door. He didn't turn when she entered. He was staring at a stack of files on the table, his posture rigid. The space was tight. The shelves pressed in on both sides, creating a canyon of cardboard and steel. Sable felt the walls. It was a physical restriction, a reminder that her world had narrowed down to this corridor, this room, this man. Mako limped in beside her, his claws clicking softly on the linoleum. He was moving slower now, the adrenaline of the fight fully metabolized, leaving behind the stiff, aching reality of the wound. He didn't sit. He leaned against her leg, a heavy, warm anchor. She rested her hand on his head, her fingers brushing the stiff, dried blood on his vest. Voss turned. He held a single object in his hand. It wasn't a weapon. It was an envelope. Manila, thick, the corners slightly bent. It looked old. The flap was sealed with a red wax stamp that had cracked with age, and across the front, a single word was stamped in faded purple ink. Pending. He placed it on the table. "This is the why," he said. His voice was low, barely louder than the hum of the light. He didn't open it. He slid it across the metal surface toward her. Sable looked at it. Under the word pending, there was a date stamp. November 14th, 1998. Decades old. And below that, a series of coordinates. She recognized the format. It was the same sector designation as the bunker, the same grid where she had killed a man 3 hours ago. The realization hit her in the stomach. A cold, heavy knot. This wasn't a new operation. The bunker wasn't just a shelter. It was a site, and Unit Vanguard hadn't just been hunting her. They had been looking for this. In the corner of the envelope, a partial glimpse of numbers caught her eye 52-point-something north before the flap obscured the rest. She reached for the envelope. Her fingers were an inch from the paper when Voss's hand came down on top of it. He didn't slam it. He just placed his palm over the seal, blocking her access. It was a heavy, immovable barrier. "Need to know," he said. The phrase wasn't an insult. It was a wall. It was the boundary of her cage. He wasn't keeping the secret to hurt her. He was keeping it to keep her alive. If she opened it, she became part of the history. If she didn't, she was just a soldier who survived a training accident. Sable looked at his hand, then at his face. His eyes were tired, the lines around them deep with the weight of things he couldn't say. He was offering her a choice that wasn't a choice. Ignorance and survival, or knowledge, and a target on her back. She pulled her hand back. The friction of her skin leaving the table made a soft shh sound in the quiet room. She looked down at Mako. He was watching Voss, his yellow eyes unblinking. He didn't care about the envelope. He cared about the threat assessment. And right now the threat wasn't the man. It was the room. It was the building. It was the system that could bury a decades-old secret in a box and send a kill team to protect it. Voss picked up the envelope and slid it into his inside pocket. "Go to the truck," he said. "Driver is waiting. You're being redeployed." He walked past her to the door. He didn't look back. He opened it and stepped into the corridor, leaving the door slightly ajar. Through the crack, Sable saw a shadow move on the wall opposite. A figure, standing guard, waiting. They weren't just being redeployed. They were being moved. Like assets. Like evidence. Understood. The heavy steel door at the end of the corridor opened onto a loading dock, and the cold hit Sable like a physical blow. It was a wet, heavy cold, smelling of diesel exhaust and melting slush. It was the smell of the logistical rear, of places where wars were supplied, not fought. The dawn was breaking, a bruised purple light struggling through the low cloud cover, illuminating a world of grey concrete and wire fences. A military transport truck sat idling at the edge of the ramp, its engine rumbling with a low, rhythmic vibration that shook the puddles on the ground. The driver was invisible behind the glare of the windshield, just a silhouette waiting for cargo. There were no other vehicles. No witnesses. Just the hum of the engine and the distant, muffled sound of a perimeter patrol. It felt less like a departure lounge and more like a crime scene being cleared. Sable stepped out onto the metal grating of the dock. Her boots made a hollow clang, a lonely sound in the vast, empty space. She stopped. She needed a moment to breathe air that didn't smell of ozone and lies. Voss didn't step out with her. He stood in the doorway, a shadow framed by the fluorescent light of the corridor. He held a clipboard in one hand and a small, sealed plastic bag in the other. He extended the bag first. Inside, Sable saw her personal effects, her phone, her wallet, her keys, but the bag was sealed with red tamper, evident tape, and a new sticker had been applied to the back of her phone case. A barcode, a tracking number. She took it. The plastic was cold. "Your unit has been reassigned," Voss said. His voice was flat, carrying easily over the engine noise. He handed her the clipboard. On it was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a standard transfer order. It was a custodial agreement. Asset transfer. Canine 773. Status: probationary. Underneath the status, a list of conditions was printed in small, dense type. No unauthorized contact. No external medical records. Mandatory weekly check-in. It wasn't freedom. It was a longer leash. Sable looked at the signature line. It was already filled out. Not by her. By Voss. He had signed her life away to keep them together. He had bought her silence with a dog. She looked at him. He didn't blink. "Understood?" he asked. The word was a lock snapping shut. Sable looked down at Mako. The dog was sitting beside her left leg, pressing his weight against her thigh. He was wearing a new vest, clean and black, with no unit patches. The bandage on his flank was hidden, but she could see the stiffness in his posture, the way he favoured his right side. He wasn't looking at Voss. He was looking at the truck. He knew the sound of transport. He knew what it meant. Move. He was ready. He didn't care about the paperwork. He didn't care about the red tape on the phone or the lies in the file. He cared that she was standing there, and the door was open. Sable felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest, a crack in the armour she had worn for 24 hours. It wasn't fear. It was gratitude. And it was rage. They had tried to turn him into a tool, into a number on a spreadsheet, but he was still standing. He was still the other half of the equation. She handed the clipboard back to Voss without a word. She didn't nod. She didn't salute. She just took the leash, not to restrain him, but to feel the connection. They walked down the ramp to the truck. The tailgate was down. Sable helped Mako up, taking his weight as he jumped, mindful of the stitches. He settled into the dark corner of the truck bed, curling into a tight ball on a pile of canvas tarps. On the canvas tarp next to Mako, someone had stenciled a series of numbers in white paint. Fresh paint. Coordinates. 50. 2.5. 200 degrees north. 13.405 0 degrees east. Berlin. Sable climbed in after him. She pulled the tailgate up, the latches slamming home with a finality that echoed in the morning air. The truck lurched forward, gears grinding as it rolled toward the main gate. Sable sat on the bench seat, looking out the back. Voss was still standing on the dock, watching them go. He raised a hand, not a wave, but a signal. He tapped his own wrist. Time. Then he turned and walked back into the building. As the truck turned, the angle of the light shifted, and Sable saw something she hadn't noticed before. "Let them come," she whispered to the receding concrete. "We are not the prey. We are the weather."